Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 19th, 2022. I've been thinking a lot over the last 24 hours of what I presented to you yesterday, and as we are hurtling toward what inevitably seems to be a third world war, which could end up in nuclear conflagration, I think it's absolutely urgent to repeat some of what I presented yesterday to give people an understanding of what is behind this drive toward war and the moral superiority from the Western leaders that is expressed arrogantly day by day about their defense of democracy against authoritarianism has to be exposed ruthlessly. Many people know that they're hypocrites. And many people are willing to say, well, our leaders are corrupt. It's a corrupt cabal in charge. But if you actually examine the mental processes that produce this arrogance, you'll see that they're nothing but paper tigers. They're liars. They're frauds. And they have to be called out on this in the most blatant way possible. So I'm going to review some of this to make clear that we're facing a moment of crisis that's caused not by Vladimir Putin, not by Russia, and it's not Russian talking points to say this, but by examining the actual language and thinking exemplified by Western leaders to see how completely insane they are. Now, let's just take a look at one of the single moments of this process. The December 9th and 10th conference last year, 2021, the so-called Summit for Democracies, it was called for by the United States, a virtual summit presided over by Biden. And in sending out the invitation, it said that the purpose of this summit is to renew democracy at home and around the world. And secondly, to defend the rules-based order. Now, more accurately would have been to say to defend the unipolar order, which is of, by, and for the corporate cartels, not an order for the people, not an order for peace and development, but for protection of predatory looting operations centered in Wall Street and the City of London. Now, one of the leading promoters of this has been the Atlantic Council, which is a corporate think tank designed to keep Europe and the United States on the same page. Now, in their report on the call for the Summit for Democracy, they had something called the Summit for Democracy Project, which said there's a, quote, need for democracies to coalesce at a time when the rules-based order is under assault, unquote. And they accused Russia and China of being, quote, more assertive in challenging the global order led by the U.S. and its allies. Now, the assumption here is that it's unacceptable to challenge that order, that there's only one legitimate order, and that is the rules-based order, the unipolar order, which is run on behalf of these corporations. Now, this goes back to the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, with the emergence of the idea of the neoconservatives, expressed by Francis Fukuyama in his work, The End of History, that all ideological struggle was over with the fall of the Soviet Union. And now the only alternative is the American-based rules-based order. Now, before the Fukuyama book, there was Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, which was written in 1979, which was then updated by Brzezinski in his book, The Grand Chessboard of 1997. But all of these works operate from the standpoint that only Western democracy, as defined by this so-called rules-based order, a free market system of deregulation, of privatization, where the private corporations have more power than actual democratic governments. That's what the Great Reset is a further evolution of, taking away the power of elected representatives and putting it all in the hands of central bankers. Now, Frederick Kemp was explicit in what he means by this in a statement he wrote at the beginning of this week. Kemp is the CEO of the Atlantic Council, and he wrote an article on the U.S. National Security Strategy document, where he says that what was put forward in this document is the way out of the war, namely, Ukraine must win. And he writes, Ukraine must succeed in pushing back Putin, and Putin must fail in his delusional and imperial ambitions. And then he goes on to say that we could fail if the civilized world doesn't provide sufficient arms, sanctions, and political will to succeed. In other words, you have to win militarily. That's the so-called democratic way. You can't win the argument through diplomacy and debate. You have to use the military. And he goes on to say, quote, Western nations can change their laws so that the $300 billion in Russian assets currently frozen in the international financial system could be repurposed to help Ukraine rebuild. In other words, change the law to legalize theft. That's the rules-based order. That's where you see writ large the hypocrisy of those advocates of this system. Now, I'll just give you a few more examples of this because, and again, I reported on this yesterday, but it's just so striking if you put it together and see the fraud that's being carried out against you and your children and your future. We have Ursula von der Leyen giving a speech saying that we have to protect Western hegemony from the challenge of Russia and China. And what is that challenge? Well, Russia and China now have too much influence on the global South. Why? Because the countries of the Southern Hemisphere are not supporting the sanctions against Russia and China. Why are they not doing it? Because of disinformation from Russia and China. And she goes on to say that this is a threat to the economic model, which is the model of the unipolar order. Now, one further example of this was Canada's Foreign Minister Joly gave a talk earlier this month to the Atlantic Council, and she warned that Russian and Chinese disinformation is responsible for anti-Americanism in the global South. Well, what about U.S. policy? What about the wars the United States launched in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, which killed, and Yemen, which killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, the sanctions that killed many more, the regime change operations which are constant from the United States, the support for International Monetary Fund conditionalities, which say you pay your debt first before you do anything for your people. Is it possible that that's the cause of anti-Americanism? Do you really think that Putin could put out disinformation that would be more powerful than the effect of the American policy on those countries? Now, von der Leyen went further. She said the way to counter Chinese influence is to cut off China's access to raw materials. Now, she and the European Union have already cut off the access of the Europeans to heat for this winter through sanctions against Russia and through sabotage against the Nord Stream pipelines. They're going to continue this policy. Now, this is where you see again the fraud when Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, says that she will continue this war in Ukraine no matter what my German voters think, unquote. Is that democracy? Or the situation in the United Kingdom where the Prime Minister, Truss, is now at 9% in the polls. She was chosen to be Prime Minister by a vote of 81,000 people in the Tory party. In a population of over 60 million people, 81,000 choose the leader. That's democracy. And now she's essentially turned her government over to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, who lost to Boris Johnson in 2019. And what's his policy? Austerity. more cuts to living standards. For what purpose? To protect the value of the British bonds, to protect not just the value of British bonds, but the holdings of bankers and the speculative bets made by bankers against those British bonds. Now, in this context, it's worth looking at the comments of Josep Borrell, the foreign minister of the European Union, where he talked about Europe as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle, warning that the jungle is going to attack the garden. Besides being blatant, typical imperial racism, what is he saying? He's saying that we, the select few, have a right to impose our will on the rest of the world. And if you try to come here and take advantage of it, it's going to be stopped. We're not going to let you. We're going to launch wars and chaos operations anywhere we wish. That's the meaning of the democracy that's pushed by these transatlantic leaders. Now, these are the governments that are lecturing the world about democracy. And I'm reporting this to you because we're going to be holding another conference where we're going to bring legislators from around the world to discuss the new financial architecture that is absolutely essential to break the power of those corporate oligarchs who are imposing this phony democracy on the world. So we'll have more on this tomorrow. There'll be a link at the bottom of the description page for this conference coming up on I think it's the 27th of October, and I'll see you again tomorrow.